Welcome to All Waves Considered. My name is Tom Groh.
And I'm Julius Spicciani, and we're going to be talking about Pensacola's surf history, and we're going to be talking about Tom's history.
Yes.
Tom, can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Well, I was born in 1945. I went to school here in Pensacola, graduated from the junior college here, 1964. I was not much of an athletic kid at all. I did a lot of swimming when I was young, fell away from that kind of stuff. Went to Florida State University and lasted one semester before I flunked out because I wanted to be back in Pensacola making surfboards and surfing with my friends and going on surf trips. And so then I made surfboards here for a while and then went to Daytona Beach Surf Shop where I was a glasser at Daytona Beach Surf Shop. Ultimately was asked to come out to California and I became a glasser at Challenger Surfboards. I also worked photo developing lab there because of my scientific background. Decided to come back to school in Pensacola at the University of West Florida when they opened. So I moved back here at 66. Went to the University of West Florida, graduated with a degree in marine biology in 69. Started working on a master's degree at the University of West Florida. Ended up moving to Gainesville at the University of Florida. I got accepted into a PhD program in biochemistry, and so I finished that in Gainesville and then taught at the university for 6 years. Then moved back to Pensacola, ultimately got a job at Pensacola State College teaching chemistry, organic chemistry, and taught there until 2009 when I retired from that. Along the way, I got involved in making pottery, and so my wife and I both make pottery, had a studio at the house, did shows, and we have work in a couple galleries around. And now I just pretty much retired and relaxed and still go surfing.
Yeah, and you just had your heart opened up.
And I just had open heart surgery, and so I have to wait. But that's not too bad. It's 30-something degrees outside
It's the
right
perfect
now.
time to
So
recover.
even if the surf was up, I'd probably be deciding not to go. Hopefully, ended up having that we timed the surgery such that hurricane season was over and warm weather was coming, and that by the time the warm weather really comes, so I'm guessing probably March, April kind of time frame, I'll be able to get back in the water.
Yeah. And if you're in a rush, you can stop watching now. That was a good synopsis on Tom's life.
Yeah.
I talked to Yancey on the phone before I came over here. I said, "Oh, what do you know about Tom?" And he said, "When I was a kid, I was looking at photos." And he said, "I was looking at photos, and there was this guy getting barreled." And he goes to his dad and he goes, "Hey, Dad, is this you?" And Yancey 3 looks at the photo for a while and he goes, "No. This is Tom Groh." And Yancey said that was the first moment he realized, oh, there were surfers before my dad.
Yeah. This is a battle we've kind of fought over the years, but did you bring that piece of paper I gave you up?
I didn't. You want me to run and grab it real quick?
There's a picture. There are two pictures of me on the last page, I think it
Okay.
is.
I can put them in the video at this section.
Well, I'm just saying, and that one of those is that picture you were just talking about.
Okay.
And he may say that, but at some point, that picture was put in a little publication that Interlight did, and it said Yancey Spencer.
Yeah.
So I went to Yancey, and I said, Yancey.
Yeah.
I said, there's hundreds and hundreds of pictures of you on Great Waves.
Yeah.
I said, you don't need to be using my picture with your name on it.
Yeah.
So I was really kind of hacked. But because I don't have all that many, pictures.
Yeah.
Even though I've surfed all this long, I don't have a lot of pictures of me surfing. So, but anyway.
So I guess I use that to jump into, can you tell me about your progression as a surfer? Can you tell me maybe about some experiences that you had in that moment of surfing? Surfing
in Pensacola on the Gulf Coast is significantly different than surfing East Coast or West Coast. The way the waves break, now I'm not saying there aren't breaks on both coasts that are kind of similar.
Yeah.
We're talking about a sand bottom. There's nothing that forms a reef. I mean, the closest thing we have to something other than a plain sand break is to surf down at the point.
Yeah.
So surfing here is I think harder than it is in a lot of other places. And we surf a lot of wind swell surf and choppy surf and all that kind of stuff. So I think people who learn how to surf here actually usually can surf reasonably well when they get into some really nice waves. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of my experience has been that as I learned to surf here, then when we'd go take trips to the East Coast and the West Coast, we surfed okay there. Mm-hmm. I didn't start surfing till I was 16, and that, if you really want to be a good surfer, that's a little late.
Yeah.
It's like a lot of sports. You need to start really young.
I was 32. Am I going to be okay?
Yeah. Well, you're probably not going to win any contest. I don't know, but I've never considered myself to be a really good surfer. Mm-hmm. I've considered myself to be an adequate surfer, a pretty good surfer, because I've had a lot of experience, and that counts for a lot. How to catch waves and what you can't catch and when it's time to bail on a wave. In 1965, they had the World Surfing Championships in Peru at a place called Punta Rocas, the beautiful right point break, right on the opposite side of a prominence in the land, and the left was called Contiki. And so when surfing from Peru first hit Surfer magazine, it was about a surfer named Felipe Pomar, and he was surfing at Contiki. But this is a right-hand break. So my father had spent 7 years in Peru,
right?
And so he had a lot of connections there. So when I found out that the contest was going to be in Peru, I said, "Oh, that'd be great to go," but I didn't expect that they would pay for me to go to Peru, just to go watch the surf contest. So when you're young, you do crazy things. And so I said, well, what the hell? I said, they don't have anybody from the East Coast representing the East Coast of the United States in this contest. Mm-hmm. So I wrote to them and I said, look, I'm a surfer. I surf on the Gulf Coast. I said, is there any way I can come? And they said, sure. And so they let me,
nice.
get in the contest. So I went down there. I stayed with actually some friends of my father's that were down there. This was, you can imagine, this was George Downing and Rabbit Kakai and all of these people that are the foundation of Hawaiian surfing and worldwide surfing. But 65 is pretty early, so the Australians really weren't much of a part of the scene at that time. But Donald Takayama and David Nueva and all of these guys. And I take the surfboard that I had made, Scott and I had made 9.6 probably surfboard. I go down there for this contest, meet at a central location. They put us on a bus and they would drive us out of Lima into the middle of friggin' nowhere. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is just like desert.
Yeah.
I mean, and I'm sure it's built up now, but then it was absolutely nothing. And so we drove out onto this prominence here, and it was all foggy, so you couldn't see the surf, but you could hear the surf. And they said, well, it's foggy, and so we won't do anything until the fog lifts. And so we're all just sitting around waiting, and it starts to get, a little bit more clear, a little bit more clear. There was a few people that says, well, look, when the waves broke, it sounded like a rifle shot.
Yeah.
But you really couldn't see how big it was. But there were some people that said, well, let's go out. So Paul Stroud Jr., who was one of the top big wave surfers back then, Severson, Surfer Magazine, John Severson, a couple other people said, well, we're going to go out. And I said, I'll go. So you climb down this cliff, paddle out. You had to stand on the beach, and wait for a wave, because it was just big shore break right in sand with rocks sticking up out of it. Mm-hmm. So and then you'd wait for a lull and run and paddle your ass off.
This is pre-leash too, right?
Huh?
This is pre-leash, no leashes.
Oh, no leash.
Yeah. Okay. Continue.
So we and you can't see the break.
Yeah.
Because it's still foggy. So pretty big shore break. So we get through the shore break, but it's a point. So the good thing about a point is that you can paddle out.
Yeah.
And so we're paddling, and now it's starting to clear up. And now we're seeing the waves, and there are big waves. They were double, triple overhead waves. So, and I'd never surfed that big before, but I had surfed some bigger surf. I'd surfed wind and sea in San Diego on pretty good sized days, and actually some pretty big waves here. So we paddle out, and now we're all sitting outside. Now, none of the people that are in this group, there's like 6 of us or something out there, everybody else is still up on the cliff.
Yeah.
None of it had ever surfed here.
Yeah.
And so, when it's kind of like if you ever saw the line from Endless Summer, you don't just paddle out and take off. You got to, think
Study
about
it. Yeah.
And so we're all sitting out there trying to decide actually what's the good takeoff point and all that. So finally, we sat there, bobbed around for a bit. Paul Strauss said, "Well, I'm going to go. Here comes a set. I'm going to go." We watch him paddle, and then he stands up, and then it's just like, here's the wave, and here's Paul, and it's just,
Yeah.
he's just gone. We said, "Oh, crap!" And and then the wave explodes and sound, and then so he said, "Oh man, he probably really had a bad wipeout." All of a sudden, way down the beach, long way down the beach, he comes flying out the back of the wave, just screaming.
Yeah.
Ah, how fabulous it was. And so, paddle over. He paddles back out. And he said, "Oh man, it was just, a really good wave," and all that. And so then a couple other people take off, and so Severson and I are sitting out there. I said, "Well, I'm from Florida. I've never, surfed in surf like this, and never surfed in Hawaii or anything." He said, "Look," he said, "you just got to go." And he said, "Don't get caught at the top of the wave." He said, "Just drive to the bottom of the wave and just, don't let yourself get sucked up to the top." Mm-hmm. And I said, "Okay." So I finally got the nerve to take off on this wave. Again, biggest wave I'd ever ridden. Got down to the bottom. I turned, I look, Jesus. Huge wall of water, but I rode it all the way to the end and pulled out. And I said, "Oh, wow, this is fabulous." So I'm paddling back out. So I'm looking maybe here to the other side of the street, about out, and there are people sitting out there, and somebody yells outside, which is the old, I don't know if you can say that anymore, but that's
means there's a wipeout set coming.
Set coming. Yeah. And so, and I see everybody, all the other guys out there lay down and start paddling like crazy, straight out. Mm-hmm. And I had gotten too far over. Yep. And so I'm paddling as hard as I could, and I went, up a wave, up the next wave, third wave, backwards over the falls. Yeah. And this is a long way out. Yeah. A good quarter mile or more out, and no leash, of course. Yeah. And so, and getting pummeled like I'd never been pummeled before. Mm-hmm. So the board goes to the beach, into the rocks, of course. Yeah. And I'm, floating in the water. So I start to swim in, and one of the other surfers was paddling back out. And he said, "You can't swim." So I'm kind of trying to stay away from the break. Mm-hmm. He said, "You'll never get in if you're here." He said, you got to be in the whitewater to get in because of the current. Just because of the, you got this outflow here, it makes it easy to paddle out, but you got to be here to paddle in. So I reluctantly swam back, and so then, of course, every set you get to dive under. So I'm exhausted. Get to the beach, get my board, so I'm completely wiped, but at least I did it, Yeah. So I climb back up the cliff, and I get to the top of the cliff, and they said, "Well, it looks pretty good. We'll go ahead and start the contest now." Said, "In the first heat from Florida, Tom Grove." Oh, no. Said, "Oh, jeez." So I had to go back down, paddle back out. I rode 2 waves and did not wipe out on either wave, but, I wasn't a big wave surfer, and of course, I think Paul Strow was in my heat, and so I did not advance, but I did it, and then I think it was either Donald Takayama or David Nueva wouldn't go out. It was they said it's just too big. I won't go out.
I want to go back to your childhood. I want you to give me some core memories from your childhood.
Core memories. One of the things I think that was important in my childhood, we were fortunate enough to be members of the country club, Pensacola Country Club. And so we lived on Fairway Drive, which was right on the golf course. It was about a quarter mile, or maybe a little more, down to the Pensacola Country Club, which had a swimming pool and all that. So I was very much involved in playing tennis, golf, and swimming when I was young. Yeah. And I won a bunch of races when I was young at at the club, but they were not talking about serious swimming here.
Yeah.
But I've always been, kind of a water person when it came to that. That occupied. I've always been kind of a scientist. I already knew I always wanted to be a scientist. I, collected butterflies when I was young, and captured snakes and all.
You're in Pensacola's E.O. Wilson childhood.
Yeah, pardon.
You're like E.O. Wilson of Pensacola.
Yeah. So. That really was kind of what my young life was about. When I was going to high school here, close friend of mine, who was a lifeguard out at Pensacola Beach, he got introduced to surfing, and he ended up introducing me to surfing, and that was a complete change in my life. Both.
Was that Scott that introduced it to you? Was it Scott?
No, this was his name was Dale Butt, and he and another gentleman named Roddy Mead were both lifeguards. And so when surfing really started here, which would have been 1957, 58 time frame, these two guys both became very interested in the idea of surfing. So they actually built a surfboard from styrofoam, and then they tried to glass it with polyester resin, but I don't, if you know what happens to polyester to styrofoam, but it just dissolves it. So they immediately had to stop. They painted this styrofoam board that they had shaped, and with rubber-based paint, and then they glassed it. So the glass didn't stick to the foam. But that was the first surfboard, probably the first surfboard ever made on the Gulf Coast, a foam and fiberglass surfboard. I was not involved at all with surfing at this time. This friend of mine would come and talk about it. And so one day he invited me to go to the beach. It was about in 1959. And he said, "You got to try this." And so I tried it. I said, "Well, this is a lot of fun." And he said, "Well, we're getting new surfboards, and order some Hobie surfboards." And he said, "So you can have this one." And that was sort of the board that I learned on, and that was like a complete turning point in my life, because up until that time, I was in the band at school. I was kind of a science nerd, not part of the social scene, and I did not like school at all because of that. My brother had been a very popular fraternity kind of guy, and so I always admired him, and it's just a scene that I wasn't part of. So when I discovered surfing, it gave me a whole different outlook on life, and I didn't drop all my friends. I didn't have that many, but I just disassociated myself from the high school scene, and got a whole new round of friends, and surfing, and we all had something in common. And the funny thing was that once I started surfing, then I'd be out surfing here, and then people from the high school would come to the beach, and they'd see me surfing, and now all of a sudden I was Mr. Cool Guy. And so they're inviting me to parties and all this kind of stuff, that they never would have considered before. But by that time I was long gone from that scene. And so that basically, surfing changed my life. That getting involved changed my life. And
I'm curious, so you have this dad who's, what you briefly told me, it sounds like there could be books written about this guy.
Oh, yeah.
And he's commander of the Naval Aviation Station. He was basically the founder of aviation in Peru, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Signed the first
Japanese surrender of World War II.
Yeah.
He had a very dynamic life. He was an extremely honest guy, a very humble guy, a very service-oriented. He spent his entire life up until the time he died, at I think 89, when he died, in sort of community service kind of thing. He was in the Rotary Club and, things like that. He was the kind of person whose life was so sort of spectacular that I never felt, I was never pushed to, and I never felt the need to try to follow in his footsteps.
Got you. I was almost wondering if the opposite was true, if you had this almost impossible standard to live up to, but you're saying no.
It was that, but I didn't think about it that way. He could not. He was 56 when I was born.
So
he was not the dad that that a kid would have that when their dad is 24 when they're born.
He was measured and wise by that time, basically.
He was busy with he had a steel building business here in Pensacola, and and had all this community stuff. So he was not the active dad, but he was a fabulous father, and a very caring and attentive father. So I never felt deprived of anything. Although I didn't have somebody to play catch with, so to speak. That turned out to be my mother. Yeah, and my mother was the one that was out hunting snakes with me and helping me build things. And so she's the one that had the workshop in the garage and would go to try to fix anything. That she was very artistic, and so that kind of influence came from my mother. I was very fortunate to have a really nice kind of almost Ozzie and Harriet childhood.
Sounds like it. So you have this very attentive, loving father and mother, and your life is starting to get consumed by surfing.
Yes, but they were supportive. Now, supportive but worried, because I had changed friends, and some of and this now we're talking 1961, 1962, and so they were very concerned that I was going to take the wrong path at this point. Yeah, because some of the people that I hung out with were not the most model citizens. Yeah,
you were mentioning that some of your friends died from drug-related stuff later on.
Ultimately, they did. The people I hung out, the first group of surfers here, that let's just say, imagine the first 15 surfers here, were all really good people, not druggies, not anything like that. But of course, as the sport grew, then there is sort of a bad element in every sport, and surfing certainly was no exception, especially back then. People just sort of became surf bums. Yeah. And so they always worried that I was going to be a surf bum. Right. They wanted me to go off to college, but I didn't want to go off to college. I got accepted to Emory. I got accepted to Vanderbilt. Yeah. Georgia Tech. But I didn't want to leave my friends, and I didn't want to leave surfing, and I certainly didn't want to move inland. So I convinced them to let me go to the junior college here. Yeah. And I graduated with the junior college, and I had reasonable grades, nothing outstanding, except in science and math, of course, but the courses I liked. But then when I graduated from there in '64, then the big decision came, because there was no university here in town like there is now, so I had to choose. So I chose Florida State University at that point. I lasted a semester there, but ended up dropping one class and getting a WF in it, and I actually failed a chemistry class. Yeah. And so my GPA was so low that they said, well, you can't come back until you bring it up. Yeah. So now I'm sort of in limbo. I'm living at home. My parents, have rules like parents have. I wasn't much interested in those rules. And so, after a few months of living at home, I just decided it was time to get out of that. And that's when I sort of started traveling around surfing. Yeah. But
can you lead me into the story? I love this. It's you and your friend Scott. What's his name? Scott.
Scott Bush.
Scott Bush. And the person who ends up being the founder of Hutson Surf Shop comes to you with a proposition.
Yeah. Well, Scott, was just a surfer that walked up the beach one day. When we were out surfing, here comes this guy nobody had ever seen carrying his Velzy surfboard. And it turns out he and his brother were both surfers, and they had been in California. Father was in the Air Force, and he had retired and decided to retire here. So they ended up coming here, and so I met Scott, and we became friends real quick, and we're still friends today. He and I decided, this would have been in the summer of '62, decided we were going to go to California to surf. Now my friend Dale, that had given me that first surfboard, had moved to San Diego when my brother who was a pilot in the Navy, who unfortunately was killed flying as a pilot in the Navy. But he had moved out there, and Dale had followed him out there. So he's telling me, I'm hearing all these great stories about the surf in San Diego, and that I ought to come visit him. And so Scott and I decided that we would go visit him that summer. So we saved up our money, and we got on a bus put our surfboards on a train, and then got on a bus and took a bus to San Diego, and hung out at his house for a month. And so that got to experience the California surf scene. And I'm very glad that I did, because if you were not around at that time, if you didn't actually experience that Gidget surf scene, you know what I mean, you missed something that was important, because surfing was a very different thing. You're very much different than everybody else if you were a surfer, and not always in a good way. But the group that I hung out with was a very straightforward group of people, and good people. So he and I spent the summer out there, and we came back here. We saving. I'm going to the college. I think he had some college courses too. And then the next summer comes along. We said, well, we'll go back to San Diego. So we started saving our money. Well, I got a job delivering photographs from a photo developing place here. He had trouble getting a job. So he was so desperate to get some money, he actually got a job working on a garbage truck.
Okay.
He lasted one day.
Oh, God.
So when summer came around for us to go back out there, this would have been '63, he didn't have the money.
Yeah.
So I went ahead and went by myself out there and stayed with my friend Dale again. And the place that we were staying in at the time was actually a house in Ocean Beach. But the front of the house was a surfboard shop. It just had boards for sale in the living room and all that, and we just slept in the back. One of the people we were hanging out with was the one who made the surfboards. So he had a shop called S&N Small and Neves. Doug Small was his name. This is Small and Neves Surfboards. And so, when we weren't surfing, then we were often at the shop. And so I was kind of observing all the steps involved in making surfboards. Scott's stuck back here in Pensacola, and we talk on the phone occasionally. And one day when we were talking, he said that a friend of his, Benny Jackson was his name, had spoken to a gentleman named Jack Waters, who owned a hardware store. And Jack was interested in surfboards and selling surfboards. And he had actually purchased some all foam boards, which were, horrible back then, especially.
Yeah. Mike Hayes told me about those.
And so he had purchased some of these, but he wanted to make them. And so Benny told Scott, and Scott got with Jack and started talking about making surfboards. So I'm talking to Scott on the phone one day, and he said, well, this guy wants to make surfboards. I said, well, I've spent the summer hanging out at a surf shop. Tell him we know how to do it.
Yeah.
And now we had done a little bit of ding repair, but we'd never made a surfboard.
I didn't realize this. So Scott had actually never even seen it happen? Or he had seen some? Because he had
No, he had
Okay,
he had
sorry,
no idea.
Continue. Okay.
So, I had to tell him, about planers and all that kind of stuff. So I came back from the surf trip that summer, and we met with Jack, and he said that he had this building. He was moving his hardware store to this new building, and it had a concrete block building in the back. And he said, well, let's make surfboards, and I'll set you up back there.
Yeah.
So that was the beginning of Hutson Surfboards. So Scott and I, we ordered some blanks from Clark Foam. We had to use local resins and things like that. So we basically talking to boat people about that aspect of it. But we ended up starting making surfboards, and we sold every surfboard we made. And as time went by, we switched over to West Coast resins and that kind of thing. But that was sort of the beginning and it was probably the first surfboard factory on the Gulf Coast at the time. So we enjoyed doing that.
And what did your parents think about this? Were they...
Well, you see, the problem was, that was a time when they were thinking, oh, why aren't you in school?
Yeah.
And so they were worried that I was just going to become a surf bum.
Yeah.
Said, no, you don't have to worry about that. But, parents don't listen to you telling them what you think because they don't think you know anything.
Yeah.
But I always knew that, I would be going back to school at some point, and studying science, which is what I was always interested in. So we made boards for a while. Then I went to, off to Florida State at that point, and then came back. But at that point, then we decided it was time to get out of Pensacola terms of surfing. So just that we had the opportunity. Scott found out that they needed a shaper in Daytona Beach. I had gone out to San Diego just to surf and hang out, and so he said they need a glasser. So I said, okay, well, I'll come back. And so I moved back to Pensacola and then went to Daytona Beach, and he and I made surfboards there for, about a year. And then we both decided to go back to California. And so we both went back out to California, and I got a job at a film developing factory. This is a huge factory. They develop thousands of rolls of film a day, and movie film and all that kind of stuff. And they needed somebody to analyze the chemicals in all of the developing tanks. And I had a little bit of chemistry background, so actually it was all cookbook stuff, from Kodak. So I'm just following a script. So I got a job doing that. Scott came. He ended up getting a job at, I think, Ryan Aircraft as a fabricator. He got hooked up with Challenger surfboards. They needed the shaper, and so Scott became a shaper, and they turned out they needed a glasser, so I became a glasser. And so we both worked there for a while. In the meantime, my parents, who were constantly bugging me about going to school, told me that I got a job at Scripps Clinic and Research Foundation as a lab assistant in a biochemistry research lab. And so that kind of convinced me I needed to go back to school and all that stuff. My parents said, well, the University of West Florida is opening up, and they're, got a degree in marine biology. I was always interested in that area. So they said, if you'll come back to Pensacola, we will pay your tuition, give you a place to live and a car.
Yeah, nice.
And the guy I worked for didn't want me to leave, and he said, if you stay here, I'll pay you your salary. I don't care about the hours, just as long as the work gets done. So, which is a pretty attractive offer as well. But the other was like, okay, all I got to do is go to school. That sounds like a plan. So I moved back to Pensacola. This would have been '67. Started working on my degree in marine biology, and Scott had moved back as well. So we decided to start making surfboards again. So we, made a few surfboards at that time while I went to school. It was under the name Design Line.
Okay, Design Line.
We got a building, when you drive over the bridge here and you turn to the right, there's a hardware store there, and the Baptist Hospital is on the other side. Well, on the other side, right where the parking lot for Baptist Hospital, there was a house there. So we actually rented that house and turned it into a surf shop. Not a display shop, but just a factory. Construction. And so we were making a few boards there, Design Line boards. I was living out here at the beach and going to school at the same time. Kind of a funny story. I go to the shop one day, and somebody had broken in to the shop and stolen several blanks, half of a roll of cloth, fiberglass cloth. We used to buy a 60-inch roll of cloth and then cut it in two, not in half though, because when you overlapped in the old days, you would put a layer of cloth down, and it would go halfway down the rail, and you'd cut it halfway down, and then you'd take another layer of cloth and put it over the rail, and it would hang down and ultimately be wrapped under. So we put out signs, find reward if you find all this stuff. And at the same time, Scott had started a surf shop, and they had broken into his shop and stolen a few boards. So we're desperately looking for our stuff. And one day, this guy comes up to the shop. I said, I have a blank and some glass. What would you charge me to, glass it? And I said, well, let me see what you got. And so he shows me this blank, and they hadn't shaped it yet. And then he shows me this roll of cloth. And I looked at it, and I told him, I said, oh, let's see. And so I carried it into the glassing room, and the other half, you see, was on the wall. I said, look, if the length of these two together add up to 60 inches, you're going to jail.
Yeah.
And so the guy just turned white as a sheet. This is a young kid. I'm guessing he was 16.
Yeah.
And Ed French was his name. And he became, a really good friend now. He's still a really good friend. And so he just about died when I said that. Well, it turned out it was some friends of his who had broken into the shop. So we ended up actually getting what they stole from the factory back, and we found out where they had hidden the boards that they'd taken out of Scott's surf shop.
Yeah.
And so they were over in the woods over there where the hardware store is now.
Yeah, like Naval Live Oak area?
Yeah, Naval Live Oaks area. Straight across. So anyway, we got our stuff back, and
that's funny.
Pause it there for a second.
You're good. That's hilarious.
Yeah. I've never been a big surf fan. I mean, I've surfed big surf, and I've had fun surfing in big waves, but that's never been my goal. I think, a perfect wave for me is like a shoulder high wave, and just something to have fun on.
Exactly. Yeah. As you've aged, so you're 80 now, is that correct? Mm-hmm. You're 80 now.
Yeah.
You've watched your ability to surf, I'm assuming, decrease.
Well, you know the progress, okay? Beginner, kook, okay, pretty good surfer, pretty good surfer.
Yeah.
Okay, kook. So I'm definitely on the downswing. But the problem though is it's interesting because it's a question of getting going and standing up. And when you get old, it's much harder to just pop up on your board.
Yeah.
So what I find is once I'm up on the board and standing there, then I don't feel, I sort of don't feel deficient in my ability to ride the wave. Mm-hmm. So I can still get a good ride.
Yeah.
But it's a lot harder to get up quick enough to be able
Brenda's
to
told me she does a lot of kneeboarding now. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I actually ended up just taking her advice. She oftentimes goes out on a short board, and so I went and bought a 710. I think it's a 710. Yeah, 710 foam board, and you don't even stand up. You just paddle, and that is a lot of fun. You act like you're in the break every time.
Yeah,
you're in the curl.
Yeah. We have a friend Rhett who has a kneeboard, and he's just always trying to get barreled. That's all he wants.
So I've enjoyed that, but still, I'd much rather just ride a regular wave. But the other problem around here is that sometimes the waves are much more difficult to get up. You got to get up quick
immediately, right?
Yeah. And they get steep pretty quick sometimes. So anyway, but I still have fun. I've had fun both on in the last year or so, both on the regular board and on the little foam board. As long as I'm out in the water, I'm happy. So.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like that's like a core thing that we share. We like being in the water, and whatever form that takes, it's a little bit different. We enjoy waves, and we like being in the water.
Yeah. Well, and I've never been afraid of the water. I get afraid like the sharks. I don't worry about sharks, and I mean, I think obviously anybody who surfs thinks about sharks occasionally,
especially when I'm by myself.
But it's a little spooky. Surfing at night is spooky. I don't know if you've ever gone surfing at night, but
I haven't.
We used to do that here, and go down at the pier, and go out, and that's I haven't done that a lot, but that's just spooky to sit there in the dark, in the dark. Jeez. It's just nice, it's nice being in the water. Thanks for watching All Waves Considered with your host, Tom Groh. I'm 80 years old, so goodbye, everybody.